Welcome back. My name is Casey Bauer. Thank you for joining me today. If you haven't watched the first video of the film photography series, I would encourage you to do that. You can click here on the link and you can watch that. If not, keep watching. Today I'm going to be talking specifically about film cameras. So we're going to look at some basic information about them, some recommendations I have for you guys, and basically the stuff that you need to get started. So the first thing that you need to understand is that in film photography, film is your sensor. So say you have a 35mm camera. Well, that is the same size sensor as a full-frame digital camera. Take for example this Nikon D3S. If you look in here, you see a mirror, but look here. Okay, so what you saw at the back there was the digital sensor. Now with a film camera, take this Nikon F100 for example. If you lift up this mirror, you will see the back here where the shutter actually is. And so behind that is actually the film. So once that shutter opens up, that's where your film is. And so remember, your film is your actual sensor. So 35mm is the same as a full frame camera, but there are also much bigger sizes in film photography. So you have cameras that are bigger like medium format or large format. And so you can have 6x6 cm format, you can have 6x7, 6x9, then it goes up to 4x5 inches, 5x7 inches, all the way up to 8x10 inches, and there's even some bigger ones. So there are tons of different sizes out there, and depending on what you decide to use, film can actually exceed the quality of a digital camera. Of course, not maybe the NASA cameras, but as far as consumer and professional cameras, film can often give you better results as long as you're working with the correct format. Now, having said that, film does not always exceed digital performance. For example, it depends a lot on your sensor size, all right, so what kind of camera you're using, what kind of film you're using, but also your development process, and then how you scan your images if you're going to digitize them. So if you have a flatbed scanner, that's not going to give you very good results. It's not going to exceed digital results. But if you have a drum scanner, which not many people do since they are very, very expensive, but a lot of laboratories have drum scanners, and so you can send your images off to get them scanned, and they'll come back at incredibly quality and high resolution. So if you're like most people today and you do want your images in a digital format, well, a lot of your quality depends on how you choose to digitize your film. One really cool thing about film, however, is that you do not have to digitize your work. In fact, you can shoot with this camera, for example, and then you can develop your images and you can print them using the chemical printing process, and you can get incredible results without even touching a computer. So remember, film is your sensor. And so when you look at these negatives here, this is a 35mm negative. You can see it's the same size as a full frame camera sensor. And so this will give you pretty good detail, but not nearly as good detail as this, which is 120 film. So this is medium format. Obviously, it's a lot bigger. And so what that means is you're going to get a lot more detail out of these negatives than you will these. The second thing that you need to understand about film cameras is that the camera itself is really just a vehicle for the film. The size of your film format affects your detail, contrast, focal length, depth of field. And so depending on what camera you choose to use for your film photography, you can get different results. Different cameras serve different purposes. So let's take, for example, a 35mm camera. A camera like this is very similar to your DSLRs of today. So with this camera, you can have everything pretty much automated if you want, but you also have full manual control over it if that's what you would like as well. A camera like this is great for when you're on the run, you're doing street photography, or you just don't have time to be moving around a bigger camera. You don't need a tripod for this as long as you're not doing long exposures. And these are also great for sports photography because they can have a higher frame rate. Now, the larger the format that you're using, What that means is you're going to be able to get a higher level of detail and also less grain in your images. All film is a strip of plastic that has a gelatin emulsion on it. And in that emulsion are silver halide crystals, and those crystals are sensitive to light. So when you make an image, when your shutter opens, light hits this film and causes a chemical reaction. To complete that chemical reaction, you have to develop it in the darkroom, but it is all chemistry here. And the silver halide crystals that actually change color to create your image is what you see if you blow up your images really big. So if you have a smaller negative, those crystals are going to appear bigger. If you have a much bigger negative, they will appear much smaller. If you have an 8 by 10 inch print, which is around this size here, it's going to be almost no grain at all. And so if you're doing real high quality landscape work and you don't want grain in your image, then that may be the ideal format for you. The larger the format is, it should give you better results and higher quality. But there are big trade-offs. Large format cameras are very, very big, they're very heavy, and none of them have any sort of automation on them. You need to use a separate light meter in order to make your exposure, and it's just not something you can work with quickly. Medium format cameras fall somewhere in the middle. Some, like my Hasselblad here, are fully manual cameras, and so you can't really move really quickly with these, but there are some medium format cameras that do have full automation, some that have autofocus, light meters, and do make it possible to kind of run and gun and get your photos quickly. So which camera is best for you really depends on what your needs are for your photography. I shoot a lot of landscapes, and so a camera like this is perfectly fine because it gives me great quality, and I don't need something that is super fast because most of the time this thing lives on a tripod. The camera that you choose is not incredibly important since film is our sensor. So your camera choice should come down to a few things. The first thing to consider is your preferred format. So what I would highly recommend is either 35mm or medium format. Now it doesn't have to be a Hasselblad, it doesn't have to be 6x6, but if you're just starting out, 35mm or medium format is probably going to be the best for you. If you need high quality, super detailed, big files, then medium format is probably where you're going to go. But if you're just starting with this, you're not looking to sell your work or blow up your pictures really big, then this is going to be perfectly fine. And you can even use this for higher quality work. But overall, medium format is going to be where you're going to go for that kind of work. After you determine your preferred format, something you should consider is your preferred level of automation. And so what I mean by that is that with this Nikon F100, I can just set it to automatic mode, or I can set it to aperture priority or shutter priority, and I can make the camera do a lot of the work for me. I also have matrix metering here on the side. I have spot metering, I have center weighted metering. So this camera can make it so that if I'm just kind of running and gunning, it's easy for me to make those images. If I'm shooting with my Hasselblad, on the other hand, there's literally no automation on this. There's not a light meter, there's no autofocus. Everything is done by hand. And so for me shooting landscapes, that's not a problem because this camera pretty much lives on the tripod. But if I'm trying to take pictures quickly in the city, then this is the wrong camera, and I'm not going to get the images that I'm trying to get. So as you consider purchasing a film camera, consider the level of automation that you're comfortable with. Are you used to shooting in manual mode? Do you know how to use a light meter? If not, then you probably want to stick with something that's much more closer to a DSLR. Another thing to consider is lens availability. So I have a couple of Nikon DSLR cameras, and so since I already shoot with those and they're full frame cameras, then the lenses that I use with those cameras will also work on my film cameras. So if I get a film camera that is the same brand as my digital camera, then I can save on lenses, these will work with it, and it'll just make my life a lot easier and save me a lot of money. The Hasselblad, on the other hand, has a bunch of lenses as well. Not nearly as many as the Nikon, but these lenses are expensive. They really are. And so I only have two lenses. I have the 80 millimeter and the 150, and they're just expensive. So the accessibility to quality lenses with a camera like this is a lot more difficult. And so that's something to take into consideration. So keep lens availability in mind as you consider purchasing a film camera. If you already have a bunch of Nikon or Canon lenses, then that's perfect. Just pick up a cheap Nikon or Canon body, and all those lenses you have are going to work fine with them. The final thing that you should consider when purchasing a film camera is overall build quality and ergonomics. So what I want to show you right now are these two cameras here. So I have the Nikon F100, which is basically a pro camera. This thing is made from metal. It's very solid. It is weather sealed. It's a great camera. This, on the other hand, is a Nikon N80, and this is basically a consumer camera. It's made of plastic. It's not weather sealed. It's very light. If you drop it, you can break it, as I have done with the bottom battery compartment here. But these take the exact same pictures. Okay? They have the same metering in them. The electronics are basically the same. The only difference is that this one is lighter, this one is heavier, and this one has a better build quality, and yeah, it feels better in your hands. So when I'm out in the field and I'm doing serious work, I like to take this camera with me because I like the way it feels, and if it starts to rain, I don't have to worry about the camera. And so that's a really good camera to take just anywhere because it's very solid. However, if you are traveling, you might consider this guy because this camera is very light, and the other thing is these are really cheap. You can pick these up for about 40 or 50 bucks, and if it gets stolen, if it gets broken, then it's not the end of the world. The F100, on the other hand, is a couple $100, and this one here at just around 50 bucks it's not going to kill you if something happens to it. This camera does not feel nearly as good in the hand as the F100, but it's much lighter. So if you're hiking and you're already carrying a bunch of gear, then this does make more sense because it's going to fit in better with your overall pack and not going to weigh you down as much. So now that you understand a lot of the basics of film cameras, how they work, and kind of what's important with them, let me give you some recommendations. So if you're looking at a 35 millimeter camera, my recommendation would be something like this. It could be the F100, it could be the N80, just something that is going to be similar to your DSLR camera because you're already used to it, you understand how that works. There's going to be much less of a learning curve, and you probably already have some lenses that will work with it. I recommend you stick with the well-known brands, so Nikon, Canon, Minolta. There's a bunch of others out there, but you got to take into account lenses and the condition it's going to be in. If you're interested in medium format, I would recommend something like this, the Hasselblad. Now this is pricey. There are much cheaper options. There's the Bronica system. There's also the Mamiya. The Mamiya is probably a good balance because you have a lot of really good lenses available for them, and you can get a lot of them in pretty good condition. And the cool thing about all of these systems is that these are modular camera systems. So the backs can come off. You can have multiple backs, one with black and white, one with color, and you can change them out mid-roll. You also have different viewfinders. So this is a waist level, so you look down. But there are also ones that you can hold up to your eye. And you can change these things in and out. You can have multiple, and you can use whatever works best at the time. The lenses are obviously interchangeable as well. And so this is a really cool system because you can set it up for whatever you're doing. Now, once you've decided on your camera, the next thing to take into account is what film you want to use. You should choose your film based on what you think looks good, what you like, and also what is going to work well with your subject. Film is much like a color preset in digital photography. Now, film has a couple things that are built into it, like the ISO cannot change. It is built into the film, and also your color balance. But the other thing about film is that if you want to shoot black and white or color, well, you have two different films for those. Okay? So depending on what film you choose, it decides if you're going to use black and white, color. Different films have different levels of vibrance, different dynamic range, different sharpness, different levels of grain. And so depending on what you want, you should decide what film you're going to use, and you have so many options out there. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that film does give you less latitude for editing than a raw image does, okay? Think of it more like editing a JPEG. You can still edit it, but you're limited with how much you can do. I have found, however, that I really don't ever have a desire to do much to my images because film is already created with a built-in color profile to create highly pleasing images. So today we have basically 3 types of films available to us. So the first of those would be black and white negative film. Now this film is great for beginners. It's easy to use. It has a huge dynamic range. You can process it and develop it at home by yourself. And it has very pleasing grain. So you can have high ISO, 1600, 3200. That's going to have a lot of grain in the image, but it looks nice. And you can also have 50 speed film that has almost no grain at all and is very nice for certain types of images. I would recommend something from Kodak or Ilford. It could be Tri-X 400 from Kodak, or it could be HP5 from Ilford or the Delta line. Those are all great films. They're going to give you great results. They're easy to use. I like 400 for black and white film because you can shoot in lots of different light, and it's a very, very usable film that's going to give you really nice results. The second type of film is color negative. So an example of that would be Portra 160, Portra 400. They're also pretty easy to shoot. They're very forgiving films, so if you underexpose or overexpose these by several stops, you'll still probably get a usable image. So these are really nice because of their high dynamic range. And the same thing applies as it does with black and white. With the film grain, it's very pleasing and something that works with your image. The final type of film that we have available today is color positive film, better known as slide film. So you may have heard of Kodachrome, which is unfortunately discontinued, but that was the slide film. And there's also Ektachrome, which Kodak just recently brought back. With Fuji, we have Provia and also Velvia, which are really great slide films. Great colors, really brilliant. I'm going to show you guys some examples in a second, but these are just really, really nice films. The only downside about them is that they're a lot harder to work with. They only have about 5 stops of dynamic range, which means you have to be on point with your exposure. Before we wrap things up, I want to go over a couple differences and similarities between shooting film and shooting digital. The first difference is that digital has adjustable ISO, which is basically how sensitive your camera is to light. Now with film, it's not adjustable. In fact, you can look at these rolls here and you can see Delta 100. Well, that's ISO 100, so that's a pretty slow speed film. This one here, T-Max 400, ISO 400. So this one is a much higher speed film, and this is going to be better for shooting in darker conditions. So when you put a roll in your camera, your ISO goes for the entire roll. Now you can adjust the ISO in your camera, and what that basically does is you're going to expose as if it were a faster speed film. This will allow you to use faster shutter speeds if needed for something like night photography. But something important to remember with that is that you can't adjust your ISO mid-roll. It applies for the entire roll, and then when you go to develop your roll of film, you actually have to develop it different, normally for a longer period of time, so that your exposure comes out correct. The second difference is that in a digital camera, you have your white balance button. Now, you won't find one of those on a film camera, and that's because your white balance is also built into your roll of film. Overall, white balance is not something you're going to worry about in film photography. Now, if you're using flashes and they are balanced to a certain temperature, then you may have to use some filters to take that into account. But for everyday shooting outside, your daylight balance is going to be fine. It's not going to give you any problems. The third difference is that with digital, you expose for your highlights, whereas with film, you're going to expose for your shadows. Now, the reason we do that is that in a digital camera, it's much better at capturing the low light and the shadows, but it can really easily blow out your highlights. Film is the opposite. Film is great at capturing highlights and not losing them, but it's not so good at capturing dark shadows. You can blow out your shadows and it will just crush the blacks, and you won't be able to get anything out of that. So when you're metering, whether it's in your camera with the built-in meter or an external meter, you need to take that into account, that you should be exposing for your shadows with film photography. Another big difference, and a big one for me, is that film can be completely processed using analog processes. It never even has to touch a computer. Aside from that, your film is going to be archival quality. What that means is that your film will probably outlive you. I have digital photos that I took even this year that I lost. I either accidentally deleted them or had a memory card get corrupted. And so it's really easy to lose digital work. But if you have negatives, then aside from a house fire or losing them, you're going to have those images for the rest of your life. And for me, that's something really important. Now for two quick similarities. The first similarity is that both can be used in a digital workflow. So if you enjoy editing your images, sharing them online, you can do that with film photography. The only thing is you have to digitize them first, and you can do that through some sort of scanner or also through taking a picture with a DSLR. The second similarity is that most SLRs and DSLRs can use the exact same lenses. Now that of course assumes that you're using FX lenses. DX lenses won't work. But if you already have a bunch of lenses for, say you have a D800, okay, a Nikon D800, well, you can use all of those lenses on a Nikon N80 or an F100 or an F4, F5, whatever. All of those lenses will work. And that's a huge advantage because you don't have to go buying more equipment, and it gets you started much faster. That's all for today. Thank you guys for joining me. I do appreciate it, and I hope you learned something about film photography today. In the next video, I'm going to be covering loading film in a 35mm and a medium format camera. So if you liked this video, don't forget to like it, subscribe so that you will see the next video coming out, and I'll see you guys later.